Hey guys, it's Ben from Board to Bits here, and this is part 4, the final part of our Radial menu tutorial for Unity. Since our last video, I have added a couple of extra game objects here, just a sphere and a cube, and I've given the interactable script to both of them with some different numbers of options. These are really just for example purposes. You don't need to add them if you don't want to, but they will show a couple of things that will be helpful here. So the first thing I want to show is that the script actually works. We do have where we have 5 buttons in a circle here, we have only 3 here, and that works well, and we have 4 here. One problem though is that when we're in a position like this, these buttons show up okay, but the blue one is really getting lost in the material of the cube itself. So the first thing I just want to look at is a quick way to add a little bit more depth to the buttons and make them pop off the screen a little bit more. So what we're going to do is go to our prefabs, to our button. We're just going to add a component, and it's a really easy one. You just called shadow, and what this does is it adds a shadow to the lower right of your object in its standard form. We're actually going to switch it a little bit. We're going to make it have no offset in the XY or in the X axis, but we're going to make it a little bit more in the Y axis. And all that's going to do, it's a very small change, but you'll see here when I hit play, it gives it a little bit more pop there, and you've got that definition, so you can see that there is something there a little bit more. It really shows off too with the red one here, where before the red would have been bleeding right in here, you really see that pop off. So it's a simple thing, but it definitely gives a little bit more professional look to your Radial menu. The next thing we're going to do is look at adding a label to the menus, because right now you see the options, but you don't really know what you're clicking. And so if you have a game where there's like a lot of different things you could be like that are close bunched together, and you want to make sure you know what you're clicking, or it's just sometimes nice to say you have a bunch of enemies that look similar, but they maybe their coloring is a little bit different or something, and you want to make sure someone knows they're attacking the fire orc versus the ice orc, or advanced tank versus a standard tank. It can be useful to have a quick little label that actually lets the player know what they're clicking on. So how we're going to do that is we're going to start by actually pulling a prefab of our Radial menu into the canvas, and our Radial menu doesn't actually have anything that we can see if we go to focus. It's just this empty square. So what we're going to do though is we're going to add to it another game object, and we'll do it right from here so it will parent it properly. We're just going to add a text object. And nicely it shows up already centered, but we're going to also center the text using this alignment, and we're going to center it both horizontally and vertically. And we're going to up the size to about 28, and because we're doing that, we're going to need to up the size of the actual box too to about 40. We can make this bold too to pop off a little bit more, and the dark is a little bit difficult to see, so we'll go down to color, and we'll make this white. We can change the name of this just to say label for now, so that if it ever comes up, we're going to be dynamically populating the text in here, but if it just comes up as a label, we know something's not working. Finally, that gives us all of that. So that is all set there. We can apply this prefab. Also, I don't know why my Y is... Oh, it's just coming up as a very small... It's essentially 0. Sometimes when you pull in a prefab in the UI, it comes up with these very, 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 very small numbers instead of 0. I don't know. I'm sure it's just kind of a rounding error, but that's actually not an issue, so I'm not going to bother changing that. So our prefab is ready, so I can delete this, and you'll see now that the Radial menu down here has that text object childed to it. So now we can get into the code and actually make that label say what we want it to. So in our interactable script, actually we'll start here, and we're going to add another public variable above our options. We're going to make a string, and we're going to call this title. And this is going to be the title that appears in that label. The other thing we're going to do is we have the option to fill it in there, but say we forget to, or we just don't want to for every single object we create, we're going to put in a little bit of functionality so that when this starts, it will set the title if there isn't a title. So we're just going to say if title equals null. Now, saying title equals null will work if there literally is no string object there. However, in a lot of cases, if we have that public field, even if you don't fill it in, it's going to actually be an object. It's just going to be an empty string. So we're going to actually have null be the second one, because that's less likely to happen. But if we say if title equals quote quote, or if title equals null, so if either of these situations are the case, if it's an empty string or if there's somehow no string there, then title can just equal GameObject.name. And so that's just going to pass in whatever we've named our GameObject in the hierarchy. You know what? I'm sorry. I am being a very bad host here and not letting you see what I'm working on. We'll zoom this in. So yeah, if title is empty or title is null, title will equal GameObject.name. So now that we have that place where we can put in the title and setting the title if it's not set, in our Radial menu spawner, we can now set the menu. Actually, we can't do that yet because we don't have the label. We need to wire up the label to our Radial menu script. So what we're going to do is say, in addition to our button prefab, we're going to add a public texture. Do we not have? Oh, we don't. We need to add Unity, the namespace in here. I forgot. I think we're referring to it somewhere down here, but we're not actually. When we're saying like color in that down here, we are referring to a UI object, but we're not. We don't have the namespace yet. So we need to include up here using Unity engine.ui. So now we can say public text, and this should come up blue for us. Public text label. There we go. And now this is the UI text from Unity Engine UI. So now that we have a public reference to this label, in our spawner, when we create the menu, we can say new menu dot label equals the object that we have dot title, and we're going to say dot to upper. And what that will do for us is, whether we have all lowercase letters or lower and upper, it's going to just make every lowercase letter an uppercase letter and keep any uppercase letter uppercase, so that we get a really bold title and we know exactly what we're writing or what we're reading. So that gives us our title, and if we go back here, we can hit play. Oh, nope, something is not converting, and there we go. Cannot completely convert string. Oh, haha. The label is the text object. We need the actual text within the text object, which has always been a little bit confusing to me, but that's how Unity does things. So yeah, label.text equals object.title.toUpper. So now when we go back here, we can hit play, and we should click and see label appears. Oh, label appears, but the actual... What else did we forget here? We forgot to actually wire our prefab. So the menu now has a text label, so we can put that in there. So now we hit play. Now, there we go. So now we have player appearing here, cube appears here, sphere appears here. And so to show you how this works with the actual interactable script, we could say name the player, let's name him Barry. Save, and maybe we'll leave the cube empty, and then maybe the sphere, we can't flee from the sphere, we'll call it like chaser, so just suggest the idea that if you ran away from it, it would just chase you, so that's why you don't have that option. So now we'll see that instead of saying player, this should say Barry, which it does. Instead of saying sphere, this should say chaser, it does. And this cube should just be cube still, even though we didn't put anything in there. So that all works. Cool. One other thing we can do, similar to the buttons, if you know you have a lot of very light characters that white might not appear too well, we can just add a shadow to our label as well. And if we hit play now, yeah, it gives that a little bit more pop too, which is nice. So that's looking good. We're doing well with our with the look of our UI menu, but it still feels a little bit flat. And this might be fine for your purposes. You might just need the menu to appear, and then you're good to go. You can select what you want, but it'd be nice to have this animate a little bit, and that's pretty easy to do as well. It involves a little use of coroutines, which if you're not familiar with, can be a little bit daunting at first, but they're really useful for doing any kind of animation or something that you want to have progress over time without having to rely on the update function throughout your game. So what we're going to do first is there's two things we can do here. We can make the menu itself populate its buttons in sort of a sweeping around that circle. And we can also have the buttons maybe grow in size to appear on the screen rather than just popping onto the screen. So let's start with the buttons and how the menu introduces the buttons. So right now what we just have is we have in our menu, we're just saying in one frame for every single button, spawn the button. So instead what we can do is we're going to add a new function here, and it's going to be an IEnumerator, not or bowl. Make sure they're very similar. Make sure you're using IEnumerator for your coroutines. And then we're going to call this animate buttons. And remember from our previous video that we're passing in this interactable object down the line. So we're going to need to still pass that in here. So we're going to say interactable obj. And then we're actually just going to take all of this and cut it from spawn buttons and paste it into animate buttons. And that's because what this script is now going to be in charge of actually creating the button. But what we're going to do is, instead of just going through this loop 5 or however many times we need to in one frame, at the very end of the loop we're going to tell this to wait a little while and then do the next one. So we're going to say yield return new wait for seconds. And there's two main ways you can use a coroutine for this sort of timing purposes. One is to just say yield return null, and that will happen the next frame. The other way is to do this yield return wait for seconds, and that lets you set a specific time that you want. So I'm going to say, just from some testing I had done before, we'll say 0.06f, and that's a float, so you make sure you're adding in your f. And that's going to give us it's a little bit longer than a frame, and it's got a good feel to it. Now obviously we had before had the radial menu spawner saying to spawn buttons, and it would be nice if we could just tell this to go right into this coroutine, but unfortunately you cannot call a coroutine from outside of a class. Even if you make it public, it's just not something that Unity likes to do, or I think it's even a C# thing that just doesn't like to do. So that's why we're keeping this spawn buttons here as kind of a helper function to just say, oh, you can publicly access this, and then just do this one. So in here, all we're going to say is start coroutine, and then you just literally write in animate buttons and the parameter there, object, and we'll save that. So now when we go back to our script here, we should, or our program here, and hit play. We should see them sweep in rather than just appearing. There we go. So you see it happens a little bit quick still, but they just kind of sweep around the circle there. Now the next part, though, is I think where this really looks even more cool, is we're going to also have the radial buttons kind of zoom in onto the screen. Like they're going to start at having no width and height, and then pop up onto the screen in a split second. So for this, we're going to use another coroutine. You could also do all of this with animators and add an animator component and set your set your curves and do it all that way, that's another fine way to do things. It's a little bit more involved for the simple animation we're doing right here, but if, say, you had a lot of different animations you wanted to do, or you really wanted to do something fancy with a lot of different factors, then it might be quicker to use an animator. We're just going to do this using scripting right now. So we're going to do another I enumerator, and we're going to call this one animate button in. And this is not going to need a parameter at this point because we've already passed in all the parameters we need to. But we're going to say animate button in, and we are going to, first thing we're going to do in this is we're going to transform, actually we're going to set a timer first, aren't we? No, we are going to set, okay, we're going to set the transform first. We'll set that transform local scale to 0 equals vector3 dot 0. And so that's just the moment that this button comes on the screen, we're going to want it to become a 0 point, just a single point on the screen, basically, or have no width and height. So that then now what we can do is we can set a timer. We're going to say float timer, and we're going to start that at 0f. So the timer's starting at 0 time, and it's going to basically count up to a certain time that we choose to set, and that's going to be when it ends. So how we're going to do that is we're going to say while timer is less than a certain amount of time. And what do we want that time to be? Well, it really depends on your game and what the pacing you want and what the look and feel you want is. It could be a whole second is actually a lot longer than you think with things like this, so it's probably not going to be an entire second. It's probably going to be more of a fraction of a second. So we're probably going to want to say something like 1 divided by some amount. Maybe it's 1 divided by 4, a quarter of a second, or 1 divided by 8. It's something you're probably going to want to do a little bit of testing on. So what we're going to do is we're going to set another public variable up here. We're going to say public float speed. We're going to set it to some kind of speed. I'm going to set mine to 8. 8f. It's got a pretty good feel to it. You might want it to be faster or slower, but having it in a public variable up here will allow you to change that in the inspector and kind of test out what feels good to you. So now down here we can say while timer is less than 1 divided by speed. So that's going to be, while less than 1/8 of a second has passed, keep on making this bigger. And then ultimately, once it reaches that point, we'll be done and we can just make it its normal size. So while that's the case, timer will plus equal time dot delta time. So what that does, if you're not familiar, time dot delta time just adds the amount of time in seconds that has passed between frames. So it's usually a very, very small increment, like around 0.04 of a second, maybe a little more or less. Could be much more if your game is lagging, but that's going to be the amount of time that gets added. So that's how we're keeping track with our timer. And then from there, we're going to use that timer information, though, because we know, if we know how much time has passed, then we know how far along we want the size to have grown. So we're going to say transform.local scale equals vector3.1 times timer. And so what that is basically saying is we want the x and the y to both be equal to the amount of time that has passed. So if only 1/100th of a second has passed, it will be 1/100th of its size. If 1/10 of a second has passed, it'll be 1/10 of its size. But this isn't exactly right, because we know that once it reaches 1/8 of a second, it will only be 1/8 of its size, and that's not the size we're looking for. We want it to be full size at 1/8. So we actually want to multiply this by that same speed, so that once it reaches the amount of time we're talking about, it will be full size. And then from there, we're just going to say yield return null. So it'll wait 1 frame and then start this loop over again. The last thing we need to do is, once we have reached this time, we want to make sure that it's the proper size, because chances are it's not going to equal exactly what we want. So always make sure when you're using this sort of a system to have one final instruction to set to the final value. So we're going to say transform.local scale equals vector3.1. So now it'll start at 0, grow until 1/8 of a second is reached. It'll be probably about its size, maybe a little bit bigger, and then we'll just set it right back to 1. And that actually has a nice little side effect too, that once they grow, they're probably going to grow a little bit bigger than they should be, and then they'll shrink back down to size, which adds a little bit of a bounce, which is a really good, it's actually a principle of animation, this sort of stretch and snap idea, that it goes a little bit further than it should and then bounces back. It gives it a little bit more of an organic feel. I'll show you what I'm talking about right now. So we go here, we hit play, and then we press, and oh, nothing changed, because once again we need to actually call this somehow. We're going to need a radial menu to tell this button to animate, and we can't actually unfortunately call again this coroutine, so we'll just do a separate public function called public void, just call it anim, and that will start the coroutine of animate button in. And so now we've added this to our button script, so now we can go back to radial menu, and just before we wait here, we'll have the button we're creating start to animate. New button dot anim. Save. Now when we play, as soon as it compiles, there we go. So you see there's that little bit, just a little bit of a bounce on those. It's probably most pronounced on the first one, but that is the result of the fact that we are in our button adding this time.delta time before we set our scale, because what's going to happen here is on our the very last frame, say timer is 90% of the way there, and then all of a sudden we're adding 12% to it. Well, that's 102%. So that's actually more. That's actually technically within the confines of what we would be breaking out of our loop in. But we're still, before we have a chance, well, before it has a chance to check that again, we're setting that size. You could actually, if we just switch these two, you'll see that it doesn't do that snap anymore. We can go back here, play. Come on, computer, you can do it. I believe in you. And you'll see now that it's not. They just go right to their size, and that's totally totally your choice of what you want your buttons to do. It's again a look and feel thing. It doesn't affect the functionality at all. But these are just a few things that make the radial menu feel a little bit more alive, feel a little bit more professional. And as you're putting polish on your game, getting toward release, you know, these are the types of things you want to be thinking about that will enhance your play or your experience just a little bit more, so that your players really enjoy your game. So thanks for watching. This is, like I say, the end of this particular tutorial series. Feel free to check out my other tutorials, and please subscribe as I come out with some more of these videos, and thanks for watching.